So I was a frequent Foursquare observer at Meadow Heights Elementary School, before and after school. Foursquare is played on a grid of squares, each owned by one player. The king in square 4 serves one of those red rubber playground balls to another square, and the player in that square hits it to another. You keep going until someone screws up and is out. The screw up goes to the back of the waiting line, and the player at the front of the line gets to start in square 1. The object is to get to square 4, where you are king, and to stay there, which is the object of all kings. Playing king is so important that Foursquare is sometimes called King's Corner. Okay, there are official rules. You can find them on the internet. The official rules bar moves like poaching, aerials, holdsies, and double taps. But there's also a rule, maybe not an official rule, that the king gets to make up new rules for each round of play. And I guess the PE teacher didn't know this rule. Or maybe he was only comfortable with the finite, bounded games played by quietly ferocious children. A couple of months ago, I was up here and I told you about this little book, Finite and Infinite Games, A Vision of Life as Play and Possibility, by a guy named James Carse. Carse says there's 2 kinds of games. Finite games, where the point is to win, and infinite games, where the point is the play itself. Carse says finite players play within boundaries. Infinite players play with boundaries. So until the PE teacher's crackdown, the kids were playing an infinite game. The point was just to continue the play itself, and that included playing with the boundaries by changing the rules. The king could legalize poaching or holdsies or soccer rules or make any rule he could imagine. Rules like blackjack, chicken feet, death rally, sharking. Hamlet said, "The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." But the Foursquare king had no conscience. The king's rules were often shockingly complex and poorly understood, and some physically impossible. How long is a legal holdsy? If the king calls sharking and soccer rules at the same time, and you shark a ball off your friend's foot, but it lands in another square, who's out? Can the king legalize screwballs without legalizing holdsies? Now, working through these questions required a certain amount of discussion and forensics. Sometimes players needed to raise their voices when others were distracted by irrelevant points. And sometimes the discussion slowed the game enough so that those waiting in line needed to raise their concerns and their voices. I gathered that this noisy democratic process irritated the PE teacher. Irritated him unreasonably, because if consensus was not eventually reached after a certain amount of reasoning, the children would just Rochambeau a resolution and someone went to the back of the line. The king served the ball, and the wild rumpus began again. There was no winner in the Foursquare because the game was endless. The before school game set up the lunch game, that set up the recess game, and it resumed as the after school game. Carse says we know we're playing the infinite game when we're transformed, when we grow. Creating this endless game of Foursquare, putting a new rule out there, a rule that might win us a point, or better yet, make our friends laugh. Explaining it, defending it, disputing it, laughing, moving on. Doing all that, that is growing a game, growing a self, growing a community. There are no official rules for this kind of game. Carse also says infinite play is the only way we can really touch each other, the only way we can really connect. He says, I am touched only if I respond from within my own boundaries by changing them, by seeing something new, spontaneously, originally. And you can touch me only by coming out of your own boundaries to see me. So touching is always reciprocal. You can't touch me unless I touch you in response. Carse tells us the hallmark of touching, of infinite play itself, is surprise. And the hallmark of surprise is laughter. So I hung around Foursquare to hear children laughing and to see them connect with each other in a community whose boundaries they were creating themselves, to see them win the power to move their boundaries together through play. Let our children's persistence and unbounded play be a lesson. When the PE teacher took away the king's prerogatives, the children abandoned Foursquare and took up Manhunt, which was their own version of another game called Sharks and Minnows. When the PE teacher made them follow the official rules of Sharks and Minnows instead, they moved on to Wall Ball. And they made up new rules for that too. And Steve, even though your friend Lucy announced very clear and exacting rules for doctoring, I'm afraid she made them up too. You may want to get a second opinion. So who else plays with rules? Poets famously bend rules to surprise us with density and ambiguity. You heard Maurice Sendak earlier tell us that Max sailed back over a year and in and out of weeks and through a day and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him, and it was still hot. What boundaries was Max playing with when he ran away and then came home by sailing in and out of weeks? I'm not sure, but I was surprised enough to laugh when Sendak told us in these 6 dense lines what it took Homer 12,000 lines to tell us about another homecoming. In Kay Ryan's poem Houdini, she bends the rules of syntax to tell us and to show us that we are transformed as we test the play in our bonds and then escape them. Her poem goes, Houdini. Each escape involves some art, some hokum, and at least a brief, incomprehensible exchange between the man and metal, during which the chains were not so much broken as they were blended. At the end of each such mix, he had to extract himself. It was the hardest part to get right routinely, breaking back into the same Houdini. Now children, Houdini, and Kay Ryan all wrestle with the metal of rules, and so do the rest of us who keep playing. We use what Ryan calls art and hokum in that brief, incomprehensible exchange with our bonds, in that moment before escape, before insight, before creation, and before connection. And that play, that escape, that means growth. Because after we escape our bonds, we cannot break back into the same old Houdini. We have transformed ourselves and the world. So let us keep playing. Let us escape from our silent square grids into the wild cacophony of the playground where we can connect. And let us honor the rules, not just by keeping them in play, but by keeping them in play.